Hey, Rick, how you
Hello.
doing?
Oh, pretty
Hey,
good.
cool.
I lost a bit of my voice last week, so I'm glad it's back.
Who are you screaming at? Don't do that.
Oh, too many people, too many people.
Too many. All right, cool. Rick, I know that you have been a Scrum Master. You work for Hepleon Consulting. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. Yeah, I'm what I call a process optimizer. I go into different companies and I help them make things run a little bit better. Usually test related, but often enough it can also be an organizational question or a communication question. Um, and I do that either just by myself, go through, enable people, or I come and I bring a team and we sort some things out, set up some test automation, set up some good quality gates, or simply just help people to learn a little easier.
Perfect. Well, with that said, I would say let's do the one final check we get to do. I do know your mic is working very well, so that's cool.
Wonderful.
Uh, do you have a share screen, a PowerPoint, or any
Yep,
demo?
I will
Cool.
pull that up.
And then with that final check, I will let you run. Let's see if I can see the secondary screen come up. I can
Are
talk
we
to
on
our.
there?
Yeah, I can see it right over there. Rick, it is all yours. Take it away.
All right. So, as I said, bear with me here. I just got my voice back, so we'll see if it holds. I really hope it does. Um, I wanted to talk to you all today. Welcome, by the way. I want to talk to you today about automation, and specifically, I want to talk to you about what I call the Tidy Tester Guide to Automation. Now, what do I mean by that? About 10, maybe even 15 years ago now, somebody came out with this book called The Joy of Cleaning Up. And if you know Marie Kondo, if you know that name, then you've probably already experienced a little bit of the philosophies that I'm going to lay out here. But what it comes down to is that we all have this mess going on, and we all want it to not be messy anymore. And the same is true for test automation. One of the reasons why this happens is because we don't do the context and the surrounding preparation for automation that we should if we really want to get it to run well. So in this guide, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we can avoid those pitfalls, what things to look for, how to make sure that you have everything set up that you need to have set up so that you can have a successful automation project. So let me pop over there. Contents, some things we're going to talk about today. There's a couple things you really need to think about before you start. If you don't do these things, it's probably going to give you a lot of issues down the line. Then we're going to talk about how do you initiate an automation project rather than just be automating certain things. How do you make sure you get a good grip on the scope of things? After that, we're going to talk about how you map the processes, the things you're actually trying to take a look at automating. And inherent in that is controlling environments, making sure that the environments you're doing the work in actually work the way they want them to and give you the results that you're looking for, or at least give you results you can trust. Then we're finally actually going to talk about building the automation. All that stuff happens before, and what kind of tips and tricks you can do while building it up to avoid problems in the future. And then we're going to talk a little bit how you measure the progress of automation, because it's not just doing it, it's also showing other people that it's being done. That provides some value there. Lastly, we're going to focus very much about cleaning up automation and avoiding those pitfalls I talked about. And that's just going to talk about refinements and how we can have some tips and tricks that makes your automation a little cleaner, a little bit neater, puts it in its place. So with no further ado, before you start, there's a couple questions that you need to ask yourself before you start doing test automation. And one of the biggest ones, and what might surprise you, one of the ones that fails the most is this one. What is your test process? If somebody asks me to come in and set up a test automation system for them, and I ask them, what is your test process? And they can't answer, that's a red flag right there. It's just pure stop. If you don't know what your test process is, if you don't even know how you're doing it manually, there's no way I'm going to successfully automate it, because I'm not sure what I'm automating if you don't actually have one. So it's important when you look at this to be able to describe your test process simply. And one of the exercises we use for that is called the Post-it exercise. With the Post-it note exercise, we ask people to explain or describe their entire test process on just one tiny little Post-it note. And yeah, that's not always easy for people. So the questions we ask them, what kind of things would you focus on? What's most important to get across? And then what would you want that person to know? What is it you want them to walk away with after in essence, it's a little bit difficult to get it all boiled down for most people. But if you ask people, if you kind of push on a little bit, most people will know what it is they're actually looking for in their test process. And that makes it a lot easier to figure out what the results of automation should be. What do they actually want to be helped with? Is it just that they want the test to go faster, or are they looking for something more stable? Things like that. So the first exercise is, what is your test process, and can you describe it? Is it something you can describe in a Then you've got the question, who's involved in the test process? Some people just say, yeah, the testers are involved in the test process, but obviously that's not all the people we're going to be dealing with when we're talking about test automation or even testing itself. We've got who's going to design the testing, the test process, the test automation. Who's going to build it? Is it the same person? Do your test analysts have the same skills as your test engineers? Do you even have a separation between them? Oh, you guys are.
Is there the PowerPoint getting stuck on you over there?
Yeah, I've got a. Yeah, no, I've got your speech from earlier playing through the session right now. I'm not sure why.
I don't hear it on my end. Is it possible you've got two tabs open and you've got the other session kind of playing on it? No, on that. All right, let me see what I can do. I'm
All
going to
right,
go
I think I got it.
You do? Okay.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
I'm here to help. That's all. That's what we do. It happens. It happens. Do want to let you know, Rick? When you get a little quieter, it actually there's a little bit of audio dropout. So I would say just keep the voice up a little bit. But I think we're good to go. I'll be hanging around.
Okay, sorry about that. No problem. We were trying to set up some streaming on the other one. Okay, so fixed it on this side. Some things to think about when you're thinking about the players. You have to think about people not always being the same people. So who will design it and who will build it are not always the same people. On top of that, you're also going to be taking a look at who's going to be using it. Is this a test automation that you're designing for a group, for a team, for a user group, for example, so that they can use a UAT quicker? And if so, are they also going to be the ones executing it? Or is that, again, a different group of people? Or is that somebody who's also designing it? And then, in the end, who's going to need to see the results? And what do they need? What are their quality criteria? What are the results that they can understand? And of course, and this one gets forgotten a lot, who will maintain your test automation? Once you've made it, where does it go? Does everybody create their own thing? Is there a central structure? Is there some kind of maintenance plan in place? Is there somebody who has that in their portfolio? So it's not necessarily that you need a different person for all these different roles, but it's important to know whose portfolio this is. Asking one person to have all of this, that's not realistic. You're going to be doing a back and forth with people during the automation. So before you even start, you should know who's involved. You should also know how much of your test process you control. Now, this is one of the more sensitive topics because a lot of people who are running a test automation project won't have environmental control, for example. They won't be able to determine whether they have their own separate test environment or who gets on it or configuration of it. Several of them will not have an easy way to import data from production and to anonymize that data, make sure it's usable. So there's a lot of parts to this where you don't necessarily automatically control your own test process. So then you have to look at things like, do you have a dedicated test environment? Or do you share this environment with multiple teams, even if it's dedicated? Is it just yours, or is it also with other people? And is it a central hub, or is it a loose container that's spun up every time? And each of those things can make a big impact on what kind of automation you're going to set. Do you have production-like data? Is it data you can trust? Is it data that's going to give you a result that you can trust? Or is it always going to be a separate data set that you have to hand create? Again, that will impact how you create your automation and where you pick up data. Is that data recent? Is it something that's going to reflect the questions somebody has when they want to use your automation? Or is it just going to work one time, in which case you built a very fancy system to answer a single question? So you have to think about, does your data actually reflect the risks that are coming up? Or is it data that was used in the past that originally gave you some results but might not show anything now? That's important to take a look at. What parts of this do you control, and what parts of it do you still need to do some things and work with other people on? Again, going back to people. Another important question before you start is, do you have a specific tech that's needed in order to test? And these can be things like specific tool sets, but it can also be things like connections and interfaces with other people, with other systems. So the questions here are your connections live in your test environment, or are they simulated? Is there a risk in simulating them? Might you maybe give a false positive if you do so in automation? And what kind of tools are involved? Are they involved just in automation, or are they involved in your manual testing? And do you have your tests interface with anyone else's tests? Is it a series of chain tests? Or does any of your test data need to be passed on? What happens if you do an automated test where you mutate your test data? Does that affect somebody down the line? These are all things that you should think about as part of your design before you even get started building it. Because in essence, you could end up building, again, a really neat system, but that only works for you. And later, it'll get messy. And lastly, the important question to ask before you start is, why are you automating? What is the purpose behind your automation strategy? Is it just money? Is it just the fact that with a little bit of investment and tooling, you can pull bugs back up from users finding them in tests and find them in tests and thus reduce the cost? Because that's a pretty basic argument that we get a lot of times from the business. We want to save money. We want to find issues earlier. We want to do it faster. So the other one is time. Are we running the same tests over and over? That to me is a good time argument for automating because, well, return on investment is pretty high. But are we just running this test once and it takes a long time? Well, then it might not be as good to automate. Maybe we should just do it and leave it be. So the question then becomes, again, why are you automating? Is it money? Is it time? Are you trying to simplify? Is it a complicated test that needs to be done right every time? Is it a consolidation of a bunch of tests that are done every time all over the system? All of these are good reasons to automate, but you need to know what yours is. If you don't know why you're building it, then I'd say stop, figure that out, and get back to it, because you don't know if you've been successful if you don't know why you're doing it. So be sure you know why you're automating before you start. Okay, so knowing why is key to your design. You can build your test automation to answer whatever need that you have, and here's a controversial thing, feel free to ignore the best practices that interfere with that need. There's a lot of experts out here who will tell you exactly how you can do test automation, but it's all based on a different need. It's all based on a different question that the person has for why you're automating. So sometimes you might want to let go of some good advice if it's going to help you get what you need. Don't be held back by that just because people say that's the best thing to do, if it's interfering with your ability to get your goal. Always know that your goal is more important than the standard. So even the advice I'm going to give you here in this talk, some parts, feel free to ignore it if you feel that it's not going to be useful. But better yet, give me a call, write me a message, and let's debate it. Let's talk about it. So when you're starting an automation project, there's a couple golden rules. The first one is don't dabble, commit. I know people like to experiment with the idea of automating, but if you're actually going to automate, don't leave it half done. If you're going to go for it, go for it. But when you go for it, commit to small pieces of functionality. Don't commit to this huge thing that you're going to do and then no longer talk about it or share it with anybody until you're done. You want to be agile with automation. You want to be sure that you can show how this gets delivered, how this is delivering value each step of the way. But you also want to keep it very structured. At some point, you're going to want to stop doing automation. You're going to want to stop doing the main building phase of automation in any case. And so keeping it structured allows you to see what value you've already delivered and where you're going with it to make a good decision about when to stop or when to pause or even when to continue again after that. So the 3 rules again, don't just dabble, commit, but commit to small things you can deliver in intervals and keep it structured so that people can see what's going on and that you can keep track of it as well. In that way, it's good to have a project roadmap. And in the roadmap, there's 4 steps. You create awareness, first of all. Then you set up a framework. Then you automate, configure, integrate, and measure. And lastly, you connect. And by connect, I mean you're connecting the automation to your other software development practices. How this works. At first, you create awareness. Per team, per system, whatever you have, you create a system map. If it doesn't already exist, this is the time to make it. Because again, you need to know what it does and what kind of impacts it has to the system, to the function. Those are 2 levels deep. You can go even deeper to the code if you're really ambitious. But you want to be able to use that to define what kind of processes that you're actually going to be automating. And seriously, do define them, categorize them. Talk about, are these business processes? Are these systematic processes? Are these test processes specifically that we're looking at? And when you do that, you can kind of not only create awareness for yourself on what you're working on, but you can also show other people the scope on which you're working. And sometimes they'll come with ideas of, oh, maybe you could look at that. Here's a big risk. Here's a big value. Can we maybe automate that as well? The second part is the automate, configure, integrate, and measure step. Here you want to be sure that you're prioritizing the things that are high value for automation. In my opinion, it's best to prioritize existing processes and items that you already know are repeatable, that already are there, simply because there's a low-hanging fruit. It's really easy to do. And that gives you immediate value. You also want to make sure that any tools or methods that you're using have been configured for your use. Most things, even when they say they work right out of the box, need a little tweaking. So be sure to get that set up before you go on in and start building. Once you've started that, then you've got to integrate automation, not just into the testing process itself, but into the whole flow of your software development. So if somebody requests a change, that change should also trigger an automation change, because that may impact how you're going to test it, or at least an automation review. And lastly, you want to be able to measure your impact and value of all of these things above and adjust accordingly. So if you notice that value is starting to lack, or if you notice that the impact is not the impact that you wanted, then you have the ability to objectively say this is or isn't working. And lastly, you need to connect. So how do you connect it? Well, it starts with creating interdependent automation streams. Developers, when they're working on automation, they typically keep that fairly autonomous. It's for the unit test. They make sure that that works for them, for the tests they're doing. But with test, it gets a little mixed. Because here, based on the impact, you might actually connect it with a business process or with a UX testing process or something further. And especially when you get to acceptance tests, that's when you're really going to be integrating people's everyday processing with the system functionality maps that you may have made in the past. Any reporting you do on this should be based on the system impact and the scope of the test. That way you keep people a little limited to what it is that they're actually trying to find out. And when you're running full chain tests, be sure to do that prior to doing major deployments, but it doesn't mean you have to do it every single time before any deployments. I will, however, later suggest to do a continuous chain test in order to address this problem in general. As part of the whole automation scope, you should have a good architectural overview. That means per domain, you should know your systems, your processes, and your components. This isn't something you have to do yourself. There are architectural specialists, there are process mappers, there's all kinds of people who do this professionally. Just make sure that there's a generally good idea of what these are so that you can add your testing processes to the UX experience, business processes, to any tools that exist in their configurations, and that all the involved teams are also a part of this map. You don't want to be an automation stream set apart from the process. You want this to be another part of the architecture of the system. Now you've got setting up frameworks. And setting up frameworks is probably the one that people are most familiar with when they're trained on automation frameworks or things like that. And the first thing you have to do is to establish the value of that process automation. And that's when you set up your return on investment. If I'm going to build in this framework, how much time is that going to cost? How much knowledge will I have to gain to do this? And how much knowledge will I gain once I've done this? And can I simplify it? And is there a way to standardize it? That gives you a general framework for how to do your automation. Once you've done that, you can set up a prioritized backlog for the components of that framework, and then choose a method and tool for automating. But this just gives you the general framework in which you can build, and that has to be a part of your roadmap. Again, all of this is done prior to you actually building your first script on there. So as you can see, it's quite a lot of context. That means that automation often comes in phases, automation projects. In the first phase, you generally do pilot projects, you do core functionality, and you take a look at dashboards. How can you make sure that people can have insight into what you're actually making and what you're delivering? After that, once you've established some system awareness and built the fundamentals, then you can engage business processes, connect the users to the automation, and then roll out and integrate to all teams once you've got a comfortable feel for how you're doing the automation. And phase 5, of course, is continuing to maintain, refine, and report results. Now, all of that just paints the picture for how a project is set up for doing automation. But it's important that we understand what we actually do in an automation project, because we're not just scripting. We're establishing awareness of the process. That's valuable for everybody. We establish the fundamentals for automation. That's valuable for testing in general. You improve your testing by doing so. You're creating and selecting tools that'll help. You're configuring that tool. You're selecting the components that you're automating, and also sometimes importantly, selecting the ones you're not automating. And then you're integrating those into that software development flow like we talked about. In the end, we're also measuring the impact and applying that automation to any further systems that might be useful to do so. And in essence, what we end up doing is we standardize those common processes and verifications to report simply and to go through quality gates based on the criteria that we want to have. So we don't lose sight of the fact that all of this is supposed to support testing by standardizing in this case, or by making a process easier. Part of that means you're going to be mapping your test processes. And that means you're going to learn a lot more about how you test. Now, a lot of people, when they start doing automation, like, I know the tests, I know what I'm doing, I know what we've tested. But it might surprise you to learn how few things are as repeatable as you think. And that's largely because we use our tests differently each time. Even people who have a set of test sets that they've already written will occasionally select one, occasionally select the other. But it's much different from having a set toolkit. So my suggestion would be, when you start doing this, make sure you've mapped your test process to the point where you know, I use this test to figure this thing out. I use this test to address that risk. I use this test on this function. And do a bit of pre-sorting to learn how effective each one of them are. In the end, you might end up throwing away a couple tests that you have in your toolkit because they're either not suitable for automation or because they're not as effective as a different test that you've thought of. But you first need to have a good idea of what you actually have. Sorry, I always share this picture to say what's easier to organize. So most people will obviously point to the one on the right, that once it's nice and easy to see, it's a lot easier to organize, it's a lot easier to work with. And that's the same with your testing. If you're just approaching test automation as, oh, I do some testing and I got to automate it, you're working with the image on the left because you have a bunch of tests, but they're not organized in any way. If you've set them up, if you've organized them in the roadmap in the way I've shown just past here, it'll be a lot easier because now you just have to select each area and figure out where you're going to plug them in. And part of that is by making categories. And you can make categories for testing in a lot of different ways. A couple of ones I suggest are, take a look for processes that already have scripts. Maybe it's a kickoff script, an execution script, a process script, and see if you can hang a test on there. Just somewhere in the code, you add verify value this. And that's how you can use you can categorize that test as, this is a process with scripts. You can also take a look at steps that are repeated. File transfers, logins, that's one of the most common ones, or any kind of steps that has you doing a similar or same function in your system. Put them in the same category. You can also take a look at regression validations. Most of the time, people have at least a small set of things that they always check before they go live to make sure that the system hasn't lost value when you go live. And having that set is a great basis to start with when you're doing automation. For one, those are easy to automate. And for another, they're clearly things you've thought of beforehand. This is something that we have decided we want to test every time. So why not? Let's automate that. Lastly, it's important not to ignore background functionality. There are quite a few things in the system that are running fine until they're not. So it's important to know what kind of tests you have that take a look at what might go wrong and keep those in their own category as well. There are many other categories. This is just a way to get started on thinking about them. That said, it's important to understand the difference between doing a validation and a test. The way I always explain it to people, a validation is if you know the value of what you want beforehand. So in that case, you know you're looking for an output of 10, and it either is 10 or it isn't 10. Whereas a test is a risk. You're worried about a risk that could present in different ways, and you're trying to figure out what is presented. That is a test because we don't know the outcome. We are not expecting a certain thing at the end. We're just testing for behavior. So when I use terminology like validations and tests, this is what I'm referring to. A validation, regression tests are very famous as validations because we have a previous setting that we know is valuable, and we have a new setting that we don't know what's going to be, and we can compare it. That's a validation. But you could also say, if we don't know the impact that's going to come out of it, then the test, that run itself is actually a test because we're worried about a risk to a certain part of the function. Tests are harder to automate, but it's not impossible to automate. So when people say you can only automate validations, I don't think that's true. You can also automate tests because you basically set it up to open the data up for exploration. There are 4 distinct whys of validation. Why do we do validation? Well, the first one, obviously, to test if something is functional. The second, to learn something in general by taking a snapshot. We have, at this point, seen this is what it looks like. And then we can do tests on what that means. It's also important to check for edge cases because sometimes things will fall between the cracks, something we didn't think of, something maybe only one user out of 100 will do. But those are also good things to validate for. And lastly, the emotional part. It's good to do validations to avoid disappointment. And so when you automate, you also want to be sure which one of these validations are you currently automating with. If at some point you come across something and there's no risk and you're not really sure why you're testing it, throw it away. Because everything that you automate has to be worth the time you put into automating. Don't just automate it because it's there. Make sure you understand why it's there. If you can't tell what risk it's covering, if nobody knows what risk it's covering, if you don't even know why you're doing it, just throw it away. Don't use a test that you don't know what you're trying to answer. And the same with automation. Don't automate a test that you don't know what it's supposed to do. It's just going to be a waste of your time. So that's pre-clearing the junk. Once you've done all that, you can take a look at those environments. And as I said before, you've got to ask yourself the questions about your data and your environments and whether they all have the things you need. But once you've done that, make sure you have a plan to use the environment. Know what you want to use it for, what you don't want to use it for. Have a profile for people using that environment. What kind of people are using it? What are they using it for? Make sure that it connects with certain data sets. So have those pre-selected as well. Because automation, above all things, requires stability. If you don't have a stable environment, you can't trust the results from the test in general, but you also won't be able to trust that your automation is going to run right. Automation does require the environment to be the way that you designed it to be, or, well, you will have successfully found something, but you'll have found an issue in your environment, not necessarily in your code. And that can take up a lot of time. In my experience, it ends up taking a good chunk of time if you haven't done the preparation, just fixing the environmental problems. And that's a waste that most people don't want to experience. So make sure you tackle that ahead of time. Know what you're using the environment for. Know how far that control extends. Also very important in this part is building reset scripts. If you're so lucky as to do a back office automation, like I did in this project, for example, then it's very simple to just delete everything that you had on there and then insert it from a backup table and make sure that you have everything set up the way that you want it to. Reset scripts can be a real time saver and make sure that everything that you test is trustable, that you can trust that the results that came from it are accurate. Because every single time you're going to reset it and run it again, and reset it and run it again. This is something I use a lot for continuous regression tests, for example, mainly because I never have to worry that something I did in a previous test is going to mess up the test I did now. Reset scripts, if they're useful for your particular automation, I highly recommend building those and spending a good time making sure they're good quality. In terms of data sets, it's good to have multiple data sets for different use cases. I know a lot of people just have a single data set, a representative data set from production, but you also want to make sure you have a couple ready to throw through an automated stream if you're looking for something specific, specific customer type, a specific functional path, or anything that you think it needs its own test category, what we established ahead of time. But make sure they do stay up to date. I had one that people were using in 2018 that was from 2006, and that did not work as well. So just because you made it once doesn't mean that's all you have to do. You have to maintain it, make sure it's up to date. Okay, that's a lot of prep work. So all of that is very important to do before you even start to build up automation. And even though you're ready to build, there's still some choices that you have to make. The first one you have to make is which of the two approaches, the main two approaches to automation you're going to do. The first one is you automate all the things that have the most value to your system delivery. And this means that you take a look at what are the processes that can't go wrong. What are the tests that you really don't want to have fail on a test level? And that's where you focus your automation. You make sure that they're stable, that you have the right data, the right environment, the right tests. You're always going to find the information you want for the most valuable deliveries. That is a very valid and very good approach. And then there's another approach that's also good and valuable, and that's automate all the simple validations. You can do both of these, but you have to start with one. If you try to do both at the same time, you're going to get messy because you're going to start automating a couple of the very difficult but highly valuable things and then see some simple validations that will distract you. Or you'll be doing a lot of those, but then you'll be like, oh no, I really should work on the other one. It's important to pick a focus where you start. After you've been doing it for a while, then you can switch over to the other. But again, this is about committing. Commit to one of these two approaches. It'll make your testing, your automation process a lot simpler. The second question you have to ask is, are you doing process automation or are you doing test automation? So what I'm saying here is, are you automating the processes to make it easier to do manual testing? So am I running the system through, running all the data from beginning to end, and then taking a look at the data myself manually? Or am I automating the tests so that I can process everything easier? Am I executing it maybe still even by hand, and then having a bunch of data analysis scripts running through everything to make sure that all my validations are good and giving signals if something is not the way that I would expect or is just to do general information? These are two distinct things, and a lot of times somebody thinks they're doing test automation and they're actually doing process automation. I've seen people build up incredible test automation suites when all they're really doing is automating the process that a user does when they're running through their process. It's not the same thing. Both are valuable and both can be used, but make sure you know which one that you're currently picking. There are four main rules for starting automation for testing. The first one, I've said it before, if there's no test process, you're not doing any test automation. Just don't. It's too messy. If you do start down that path, I guarantee you, it's just going to be you looping back around again. Make sure you have a test process. Second thing is, don't obsess about how it looks when it's done. A lot of people like to have these brilliant looking frameworks with every single thing built up. That's not really the most value you're going to get out of the automation. It looks nice, it looks tidy, but that doesn't mean it's actually giving you the value. So focus more on what you're trying to achieve, how it feels when you're done. What do you feel about your tests once they're automated? Do you feel more trusting? Do you feel that your tests are more valuable? Do you feel that it saved you time? That's more important than the way that it looks all nice and organized and wrapped in a bow. The third rule is don't invite others, and by others I mean people outside the automation project, to automate with you when you start. We like to do knowledge sharing sessions. We think I'll just pull this person in from this project, this person from this project, we'll learn together. In essence, the more people who don't know as much about you as your system, who are helping you, the more clutter you're going to leave behind. You're going to be much more effective when you're, and by you I mean maybe not just yourself, but your team, are searching through the most vital things and making sure those things are getting automated and those things are getting attention, rather than some of the things other people might think look cool. So don't immediately start with the organization-wide grab. Start focused in your team. That's a big part of the last one is don't go too big. in your first approach. Don't try to automate everything all at once, but be the example for your team, for your system, for your department, whatever that scope is for you. Be that example, and then once it's established, then go for the big approach. This one basically means put a rein on your manager and say, whoa, hold on there, let's make sure this is valuable and that you can see the value in this and that we know we're spending our time wisely. When you start, it's important to make an organized backlog. Just like any project, you want to have something that you can continue to work on. Don't start working on anything as far as like pure coding scripting that you can't finish in a day or two. Because at the beginning, what you want to do is quick, modular, functional scripts, things that are simple, things that are easy to translate and pick over. You don't want to pick up a big 21-point item and start automating that thing, just pieces. If you need to break it down, break it down. Break it down until they're tiny little pieces. Eventually, you'll be able to put these all together into nice, it's like using Lego blocks. You'll be able to put them together into nice functional blocks. I would suggest that you don't pick your favorite test first. And two big reasons for that is, one, you're not practiced at it yet, so your favorite test might end up failing a lot, and that might make them no longer your favorite tests. And the second thing is, if you like doing the test so much, maybe that's not the first one to automate. Automate the other stuff and keep doing the fun things, the ones you like to do. It's also important because the other things are usually low-hanging fruit. They're repeated tests with simple outcomes. Those are the ones that you can grab really easily for quick value. They're also the ones that give you the best practice because you're going to be more or less successful with those right off the bat. And as you make simple mistakes, you'll avoid bigger mistakes in the future. The bigger the functions are, the more pieces you're going to have. So make sure that you kind of focus on those small ones. You started off, but now you want to measure it because, well, this might take a long time, especially if you're breaking it down into tiny little pieces. So as you're building, it's important that you can report to people what you're building, how you're building it, and maybe even showcase it a little bit. That doesn't mean that you're going to show them the automation stream. Half the time, it won't be running right unless you've built all those little modular components. So showing them individual functions bit by bit, that can be a bit disheartening. But there is an easy way to show people the progress, and that's by showing them the bigger picture and where you're filling things in. So I usually use 4 different components for that. There's the fundamentals, the configuration, the components, and the integration. And each of these, I show in how far automation is meeting the goals for these areas. So in fundamentals, how far is automation meeting the goals set in our test strategy? How far is it meeting the goal of our automation strategy that we built off of that? And how much of that process preparation have we done in order to actually go for our automation? That should be fully full by the time we actually start building, for example. In configuration, we're taking a look at our general, our maintained, our optimal, and our potential areas. It's an important thing to know that your general configurations are things like what runs in your process normally without any interference. Your maintained configurations is what things do you have to actively change in order for your test to run. Your optimal ones are obviously the goals that you want to have at the end. And your potential ones, the ones here, those are the most important ones to have when you're talking about what we're gaining from automation. So if you can make goals out of these and measures, then that's where you put that in. Components is actually one of the simpler ones. It simply counts how many components are in your system and does a percentage for how many of those are automated. That doesn't mean that you're going to do 100% component coverage. Set a goal beforehand of how much percent, and then you do a ratio of how far you are to get there. And lastly, integration. This is a bit more subjective, but it's something that I suggest you work with your Scrum Master on and figure out how much integration of that automation you've already built is a part of your software development cycle. As I mentioned earlier, one of the most fundamental ones is if a change comes up that's going to change the way your process works, does that trigger a change in your automation? Does that trigger a check to your automation? If a different value is added to potential business outcomes, does that change your automation? Is that integrated into your process? So these are, as I said, a bit more subjective, but if you set the goals up beforehand, you can easily show the progress in that. I use simple visualizations for this. No need to get too complex. You can set up really neat dashboards. I literally built this in Excel. What I do is I show in each of these areas how much we've done, and then I have usually a color code legend for this means somewhat, this means definitely, this means we haven't started. And then this can show people how far we are along the process. You can also see here, this is what I did for a project back in 2000, apparently 2029, that's a typo, 2019 and 2020, to show how our build was going versus our goal for the components getting automated here. These are just ways to make it simpler for other people to understand what you're doing without having to showcase each and every individual automation thing you've set up. Another way you can do that is to show the impact. Now, this one's pretty powerful if you have to keep on proving why we should continue the automation project. This one actually comes from one of those projects that I did, in which we showed that based on the previous recorded measurements of how long it took for these processes to be run and how much percentage of time that we got back, we could showcase that. We saw that on average, because of our changes, we saved 22 minutes every time that we would ordinarily run this test process by running it with our automation scripts. And that meant that we had a return on investment of 14 for every 1 minute we put into it. And that was done by taking a look at how much time we put into it. And those are just some neat ways to show that you actually are getting value out of the time you're putting into it. It can also show you sometimes that it takes a long time to win it back. You can have it be a reverse, where it takes you 14 minutes for every 1 minute that you saved, which means it has to be a test process that you do at least 14 times in order to break even. That's why I say it's important to know what you're automating. If you're automating things that are important but only happen once, it's very hard to get your return on investment for that. But if you're automating things that happen all the time, well, if you run it 100 times a day, it doesn't matter if you spend 100 minutes making that 1 minute save, you've already won it in a single day. The other thing you can do is you can talk up what it does from a test perspective. So the ones on the bottom here are things that I would report to a manager, for example. I'd say, well, we found there are multiple standard process bugs, things that were going wrong in the past because we were not testing it consistently. But now we find them because we test it consistently. And we have those standard measures established, and that allows us to set up an automated regression run, which means we don't have to manually do all these things anymore. And our test data creation was also greatly sped up because we automated that as well. And so you can showcase these particular things as a way of saying our automation isn't just about the little functionalities we're making, but the real impact it's having on our work, on other people's work, on our time. Once you've built that, once you've shared that, once everybody's happy with all your reports in it, it's time to refine. Because just because you built it once doesn't mean it stays fine. As you automate, you're going to make redundancies. You're going to build scripts that you've already built before, you forgot about it, and you're going to make mistakes, something that doesn't work the way you thought it would. Accept it. That's going to be a part of the process. But do plan to go back and refine regularly, because you're going to find these. Every time you go back over, you're going to find another thing. Oh, I could have done it that way. Oh, I've done it in 2 places the same. So refinement is a huge part of test automation and keeping it clean. And you can do that by thinking of a human versus a machine. So a human tends to test a certain way, and a machine tends to test a different way. One of the first tests that I did was to take a look at how somebody did a manual test versus how the automated script ran it. And anybody who's ever done UI testing will tell you that's a pretty clear distinction. Because while we might look visually for what's on there and pick it from the UI, it's faster for a test script to just pull up the command from, say, a command prompt. And so why would we have it search through the UI if that's not the real test? If all we're doing is trying to execute the command, maybe we want the machine to just execute the command. And that's something the machine can do that the human can't. One of the examples that I always say is wait. So if I am doing a test and I'm running a process and I'm waiting for it to open, I am actively waiting because, well, it's supposed to open and okay, there it is, it's opened. But a machine, it opens something and immediately looks for the next instruction. So if you tell a machine, okay, open this and then select this, it's going to try to select it. It's not going to be there because it's not open yet. And then it says, oh, I failed. And that's something you have to start thinking about. Oh, do I have to tell the machine to wait? Or do I have to tell the machine what to look for before you do the next instruction? How does the machine work versus how do I work? And that's part of refining it, making sure that your test script go from human to non-human. There's also modular construction. This is an example of something that I built in a testing tool. And I originally created a whole bunch of different functions all by themselves, and I linked them up together in this giant map of functionalities. Just everything was going all at once, because that's the way I did it, manually. I would run this, then I'd run that, then I'd run that, then I'd run that, then I'd run that. That was my document. But I found that in my automation, that made it look extremely messy and very busy. So what I ended up doing was I created modular functions. I said, if you're going to read variables, then you're going to run this script right here. Doesn't matter what variables it was. I made it general. If you're going to launch the server, you're going to launch this process right here. I'm not going to put this in here after you've read the variable. I'm just going to say, go to this one. If you're going to select a particular folder location, use this function. If you're going to create new folders, use this function. And in essence, what I ended up doing is creating a program on top of a program by adding these different modular constructions together. That's why I say you're going to first build these things up, and then as you build these ones up, you're going to be able to build these larger scripts a lot easier. If you start with this, you're going to get a giant map with a lot of functions, and it's going to look very busy, and it's going to be really hard to refine. But if you keep on trying to cut them into smaller pieces and give them their own little functional map, then using those components will be a lot easier for modular construction. You can reuse them, you can make them more generalized rather than specific, and in the end, you can do a lot more with them. One of the things you can do with that is do true global consolidation. The one on the left is my original setup, and I had it reading every single line from an Excel document. Let's just say that took a long time to program in correctly and make sure that it was working. But once I did that, I realized that I didn't actually have to do that. I could just have it read a particular type and read that through to the document, to the information that I have in the system. So that's where this one came in. But then I realized I didn't even have to do that. I just had to have it loaded up entirely and put every single variable together with a variable I defined in another module. And because of that, I took this whole giant script here, threw it away, this whole thing, threw it away, and I ended up just with this. And that makes it a lot faster, a lot easier to use, and I can apply it to any Excel. I didn't have to specifically define which line, which value, what the name was going to be. I just had to make sure that there was a single point of execution, or a single point of maintenance, as I called it. And that was just that same Excel file. I just added a variable to it, this column right here. Still had the same values it was reading, but I put the variable in the Excel rather than the code. That was a manual step to make my automation a lot simpler, a lot easier. Being able to do this rather than this saved me, this took me so much more time. Just by adding a single column in here and adding that in manually, I was able to improve my test automation. So don't get caught up with everything needing to be automized. This can actually save you a heck of a lot of time to do it by hand. There's another funny story in that a colleague of mine was very excited about doing automation, and he decided that he wanted to automate the transfer from the local computer to the file server. And it took him 8 hours to do that. And he was very proud of his script. He said, look, press execute, it ran, it moved the file over. I said, okay, how long does it take you to do that normally? About 5 seconds. He opens the folder, he drags it over and does that. And then I asked him, how many times do you do this? I said, well, for this one, we actually only do it once every 3 months. And at that point, he kind of cottoned on to the idea that it was going to take years before we would ever get the return on value from what he built there. So sometimes a manual step, key to your good test automation, do a good manual step. On the other hand, there's manual steps that are very annoying to do all the time. This one, for example, the entering a password. A lot of times when we do our test automations, we always spin up a new environment each time, which means we have to log in each time. And just building, even if it's the very first automation thing you build, is a login automation, can save you so much time, even if you do the rest manually. Just to have it automatically log you into things, chef's kiss, one of the best ones to do. It's also a single point of maintenance. There is, of course, a question of security. You want to make sure you have a tool that anonymizes your password, or that you're using just a test password for it, because that can go bad really quickly in the security world. But do make sure that as much as possible, if you have any manual input, make it a single point. If you're worried about trying to create a very complicated structure in which you have to name everything, maybe make it manual. When it comes time to actually implement all these things, who's doing it? We talked about the players, who's going to be running it, who's going to be maintaining it. One of the most successful things I've seen in my experience is something called an integration quality team. And what this team does is they basically connect all the local testing streams to a single system stream and do a systems regression test. They then send those results back to the local teams and thus create a canal, stream, river, ocean approach, where the team builds their own thing in the canal, sends it into the stream for local testing, sends it to the river for the continuous testing, and then sets it live in the ocean. This construction creates a single point of truth for all the involved teams. But what it also does is it creates a single point of automation. If you can start your automation on an integration quality level, then you can use pieces of that for the individual systems. That way, you're always building towards something bigger. What I mentioned earlier is that if everybody's building their own automation and they try to put it together, sometimes it doesn't fit. If you have something like an IQ team, then you end up getting a system where everybody combines their code and their data, and then eventually also their automation scripts, and that the IQ team takes that in, works it over, refines it, makes it work together, and then sends it back to the team for review. And this becomes this feedback loop that consistently makes people aware of what's going on in the automation and aware of the results of the automated tests, but also allows them to reuse pieces of that automation in their individual project teams. So sometimes if people are really struggling to get their automation to align, I would suggest set up an integration quality team that helps them to keep it very well refined. Now, these aren't without their pitfalls. There's obviously always going to be problems in automation, and I'd like to go over a couple of the more common ones to make sure that we can avoid the heavy impacts in the future when you get started on this. So this is actually directly from a report that I made for a project, but it's so common that I've ended up just copy pasting it on pretty much everyone I've done. So the 5 most common pitfalls: there's a lack of official dedicated time to automate. It's just considered, oh yeah, do that on the side. That's not committing. You really have to have it be your own action. It has to be a separate thing. It can't just be something you do on the side. You need to take the time to do this well. You also need to include them in the regular sprint. This can't be a side project as an organization as well. You have to think in terms of the core, how can this work with everybody kind of being aware of it and knowing that the tester's time, maybe a developer's time, maybe a project manager's time is taken up on working on the automation. And that's just going to be part of what you do to provide value as a team. You also make sure that people are trained. It's great that we can all self-train and think about all the different ways we can do tooling or how we can automate with different methodologies, but official training really does help, especially when you're talking about using tools. So if you do have a tool, make sure you get trained in that tool. If there's a particular methodology you're using, make sure you get the space and the time to train in that. You should also understand that the complexity of the system is going to give you issues. So break it down as much as possible. Make sure you have your data flows. Do the prep that I said beforehand. You won't have that pitfall. And lastly, any partners that you need to do configuration to set things up for automation, for example, for prepping environments, those are things that you want to keep a careful eye on, because if you're dependent on them, then all your goals are going to be dependent on their delivery. So keep your eye on that. These are the 5 most common pitfalls. There's also other issues that can come up, where I talked a little bit about system complexity. We talked a little bit about time to automate. Make sure that you're checking in and that the things you're automating are worth automating. You want to be sure that the roles for coordination are there, that people are keeping an eye on what's going on and who's doing what, and that the reports you're making are clear to people. You want to make sure that the environments are being used correctly, that they're being checked and maintained, sorry, that the fundamentals are not being missed and that you have the time budgeted. All of these are issues that are worth exploring to make sure that they don't happen without you being aware of them. So again, this is kind of risk management to keep this in track. To summarize, before you automate, prepare. There's a lot of preparation that I talked about. I know it sounds like a lot, but trust me, it'll save you so much work in the end, and it's a lot less work than fixing it as you go. Become intimately knowledgeable with your tests. If you don't know what tests you're automating, you're going to run into trouble, and it's not going to be as fun. You also want to, quote, kill your darlings. These are tests that may have been around for a long time. You have no idea why they're there. They don't help you. They don't tell you anything. Get rid of them. Control your environment if you can. Otherwise, make sure you are well connected with the people who do control your environment. Make sure that you can trust that what it produces is something you trust as a test result. Build with long-term plans, but with short-term goals, with short-term delivery times. Make sure that you can feel that momentum by continuing to deliver small pieces of the functionality and then build them together into larger chains. Showcase your work. Make sure people know what you're doing, how far you're getting, so that it doesn't just look like you're off in a cave building some wondrous machine you'll show in 3 years. Showcase what you're doing now. Make sure you refine the work that you're doing, both during and after your project. Keep coming back to it. And beware of the common problems and common organization problems that get in your way. That would be my biggest advice for keeping your testing clean, for keeping it going effectively, and to continue going forward. One last thing before I end, I don't want you to forget that automation is one of the investments in testing. And while it does affect a lot of the others, all the other things also affect automation. So if you invest in skill, in static knowledge, in awareness, in risk management, in alignment, and in the fundamentals of testing, it's also going to boost your automation. So as much as I can get excited about this topic, don't forget to think about the other things because they'll help you go faster, stronger, and make better test automation. Thank you.
All right. Rick, thank you very much for that informative session. And I just had like one question about I wanted to follow up in just a few seconds. And then we would also like to have you just give a little shout out about the session over here. I wanted to go back to the slide that you had about humans versus machines. Obviously, AI, generative AI, and all that stuff is the big thing that's going on for the last 2-3 years. Do you have any opinions or thoughts on that versus with how it's impacting test automation?
A lot of thoughts on that. It'll be a whole different talk. Yeah, I think that actually there's a lot to be won with AI and test automation. Test automation right now is really going under a revolution because of AI and about how AI can help us script faster, to do these consolidation checks faster. It's really exciting. So if you aren't read up on it now. There's a lot of great new developments going on in AI-assisted automation.
Perfect. If you wouldn't mind, our moderator is going to bring you up on full screen. And if you could give us a little testimonial on your experience here at Zappletech, and we'd really appreciate it.
Sure. So yeah, that was the session on test automation and how you can make it tidy and clean from Zapple. I thank you very much for inviting me to this event. I hope that you all got a lot out of it. And thanks for all your support as well. And I look forward to learning more from the other presenters as we go on.
Great. Rick, it's been a real pleasure having you speak over here. We're definitely going to invite you back so we can get more into automation and how to optimize our processes. It's been a pleasure.
Sure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.